Having selected the area of research, formulated possible research questions or hypotheses, spent some time looking at the overarching research design and considered the role of secondary research methods and what they may add to the research project, it is now time to consider primary research methods. Primary research methods will be considered in this slide series. When we talk about research methods, what do we mean by a research method? A research method is actually a technique for collecting data. We're going to look at two different approaches to research methods. The first is what we call quantitative methods, and the second is qualitative methods. So what do we mean by a quantitative research approach? A quantitative research approach is a research strategy that is based on the quantification of data in its collection and its analysis. It can be used to generate theories, but generally when we're thinking about quantitative research methods, we're thinking about things that are involved in actually testing theories and testing hypotheses. A quantitative research approach, this we think of as being deductive, and that means really that it aims to deduce meaning from particular individuals or cases based on broader principles. It can also be reductionist, and that is, it may actually break a particular theory or problem down into its many component parts and test each element of that separately. We also think of the quantitative research approach as being objective, and that is that the phenomenon that's under investigation must be observable and verifiable. So what do you mean by a qualitative approach to research? Well, here we're thinking about a research strategy that is based on the collection of non-numerical data, okay, so qualitative data, and the qualitative research approach is often used to actually generate theories rather than test theories and test hypotheses. With a qualitative research approach, we often think of it as being inductive, so rather than deductive. So here it actually aims to generate theory from research. It can be interpretivist, so it's about understanding the social world through looking at the interpretation of the world by its participants. It can also be constructionist, and that is, it's associated with the idea that life is socially constructed. So it's about how people create their own social reality through meanings. And here you can see the slightly different approaches. If we start with a deductive approach, we're testing theories and then looking at the observations and findings. With inductive, we're sort of doing it the other way around. We're collecting our observations and findings and then generating theory from that. So deductive reasoning works from the more general to the more specific, with conclusions following logically from the premise. Sometimes we call that a top-down approach. With an inductive approach, we actually move the other way. We move from specific observations to broader generalizations and theories, so we're going almost in the opposite direction. So those are the two different approaches that we can take. So we can take a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. In summary, when we think about quantitative, we're looking at data that is presented numerically. We're looking at sort of descriptive, explorative and causation, and looking at theory testing. We're also looking at what we call nomolethic explanations, and those are sort of broad, partial explanations that we base on a large number of cases. With qualitative, we're looking at collecting, rather than numeric data, we're looking at collecting text, word, images. We're looking at collecting a complete an explanation as possible and focusing on far fewer cases. The general advantages to quantitative methods that we may use in our research designs are that it's easier to generalise from our sample to the general population. Quantitative methods, they enable us to replicate them in other times and places. We can collect information from a very large number of respondents, and often it's sort of much more minimal in terms of interviewer requirements and interviewer skills. Sometimes you can actually get respondents to complete themselves, i.e. through doing postal surveys and so on and so forth, or internet surveys. Of course, it makes it very easy to analyse because we're actually collecting quantitative information, so numeric information. We can plug that straight into, your general analysis package and get on with it. And the standardisation, so everything is asked, phrased, and placed in the same format. Disadvantages to quantitative methods are about things like limited access to respondent meaning. So we are looking at a very limited set of information. Okay, we're not looking at collecting the rich data. This can also mean that it leads to poor internal validity because we're not exploring the full story from people. It provides us with a snapshot, and the researcher actually decides what they're going to collect rather than allowing the person that's responding to respond in the way that they want to. It also provides, and in this way it provides very sort of limited value for very small scale research. Small scale research, we're generally looking at wanting to find out more than what quantitative methods can allow us to. The advantages to qualitative methods are, of course, we have completely unlimited access to respondent meaning. They can tell us anything that they want to. This leads to those methods having very good internal validity. Respondents, so the people that you're interviewing or talking to, they will have some control over, what they want to say, which makes it absolutely excellent for small-scale research because you're collecting far richer and more detailed data. Disadvantages to qualitative methods, well, of course, they're the they're the kind of opposite to quantitative, in that, of course, with qualitative, it's very difficult to generalise to any larger population. Of course, you're limited in how much you can replicate. So if you were to do the same series of interviews with in a different geographical area, there would be things that would be very different. You're dealing with only a small number of respondents, and to actually work with people qualitatively requires a huge amount of skill on behalf of the interviewer. The analysis, so the information that you get back, the text that you've written down, it's very, very complex to analyse, and there's absolutely no standardisation. So having thought about the quantitative approach to research and the qualitative approach to research, there is now a choice about what kind of methods to choose for your research project. Now, good research is actually about choosing methods that are most appropriate to the research questions. Some questions are underpinned by positivist assumptions and other interpretist. It is not often that a project will present itself with one research question that neatly fits along one particular philosophical way of thinking. You need to think about what the aim of the research is and what your research questions are, what research design is most appropriate to fit that, and then what methods would actually be best suited to answering those research questions. You always need to think about what best collects the information for the research questions that you're asking. Now, if we think about quantitative primary research methods, there are, as we looked at in the first slide, there are two primary quantitative research methods, and these are the survey and the structured observation. Now, the survey method can be delivered in two main ways, through either structured interviewing, that's either face-to-face or via the telephone, and through self-completion. So, for example, a survey that's delivered through the post or completed online. Structured observation is another method of collecting primary quantitative data. Now, if we take each one of those in turn, we'll deal first with surveys as a primary research method. Surveys, whether we administer those through structured interview or via self-completion, they follow exactly the same principles. and that is that questions are usually closed-ended, with all respondents being asked the same questions using a fixed schedule or questionnaire. These principles have positive implications for both accuracy and, importantly, the ease of dealing with and presenting and processing the data that has been generated. The advantages and disadvantages to specific survey methods, so structured interview conducted either face-to-face or via the telephone, and the various methods of conducting self-completion surveys, i.e. via the post or online, will be discussed in depth in slide set 9a, which looks specifically at quantitative data collection methods. Now, there are a number of questions that you need to ask before using a survey as a primary quantitative method in your research, and the key question to ask is whether a survey is actually appropriate. So, will a survey actually provide you with answers to what you want to know? Will the population that you're seeking to survey, will they actually be able to answer your questions? Is a survey most appropriate for asking that particular population group? When and where are you going to conduct your survey? And of course, it's important to remember the disadvantages with survey research, okay, in that you're going to get very limited access to respondent meaning, which leads to poor internal validity. You of course get social desirability as a potential effect, that is, people answering surveys in the way that they feel is most socially desirable, so not revealing what they truly feel. You may get this better from qualitative research. And of course, if you're only doing a very small research project, sometimes surveys aren't actually really that useful for small scale work. Now, the second type of quantitative primary research method is the structured observation. Survey research can be problematic in investigating behaviour, and one of the things we can do is actually observe behaviour instead. So structured observation is the systematic observation of behaviour and recording it in line with some set categories that are devised before we actually start collecting our data. When we're looking at structured observation, the researcher will use a set of rules for the observation, so they'll set a set of rules before they actually start, and that those rules are about what the researcher is actually looking for, the type of behaviour that they're looking for, how this behaviour should be recorded, and what time period the observation should be for. So are we looking at, an hour, 2 hours, 10 minutes, so on and so forth. An observation or coding schedule, we construct that, and that's similar to a structured interview schedule. So we structure that exactly as to what we're going to collect, when and how, and those kind of things, and we do that so that we can record our observations in the same way every single time. The data that we generate resembles survey data, so the behaviours that we're recording, they're treated as variables, and it's often underpinned by a cross-sectional research design. So it's used quite often in things like market research, when you're trying to understand, say for example, within the first 10 minutes of going into a supermarket, where a person goes, what they go and pick up, the shelf level that they tend to collect their goods from, so on and so forth, and it helps with supermarkets knowing where to lay out their goods. Now, with structured observation, it is of course important to remember what the disadvantages are before making your decisions about what to use. The main disadvantages with structured observation are around reliability and validity. So with reliability, we're thinking of inter-observer consistency, so that's the extent to which two different observers would record the same thing. And we also think about reliability in terms of intra-observer consistency, and that's the degree of consistency of the application of the observation schedule over time. So if you were to do the same observation again, how consistent would you be in what you recorded? Second thing obviously is validity. So we're looking at variability in observers over time, and also whether people are actually changing their behaviour that you're watching because they know that they're actually being observed. As we previously looked at in the first slide, there are two primary qualitative research methods, and those are interviewing and observation. Interviewing can be delivered in two main ways. That's one is through one-to-one interviewing, and the second is through group interviewing. Observation is another method of collecting primary qualitative data, and we're going to discuss these methods in the context of ethnography as well. So when we're looking at the first type of qualitative research method, that's interviews, they're usually grouped as follows. We usually have what we call the structured interview, and that is where we're looking at a survey and we're thinking about quantitative methods here. We also think about semi-structured and unstructured interviews, and those are the two that we focus on when we're thinking about interviewing qualitatively. Qualitative interviewing usually follows the same principles. For semi-structured interviews, we use both closed and open questions. For unstructured interviews, we tend to use no real form of sort of set questions. We often have maybe just themes, or a general sort of set of things that we want to explore with the person that we're interviewing. And in both of these cases, both the semi-structured and the unstructured case, the interview process is actually flexible. If we think about a survey, the interview process is completely inflexible. There's no room for deviation. With semi-structured interviews, we have to start off with actually developing an interview guide. And the interview guide, to do this, we go through a few different steps. And the first is to think about the general research area and specific research questions that we want to find the answers to. We then devise a set of interview topics that will help us to get the information we need to answer our research questions. We formulate our interview questions that sit within each of these topics. We then spend some time going backwards and forwards and reviewing and revising the questions, making sure that they're absolutely right. We then do a pilot. Okay, so actually pilot your questions and make sure that that they are answering and getting the information that you want. We then identify any issues that have come out of the pilot study and revise our interview questions accordingly, and that then leaves us with our finalised guide. Now, the type of questions that we use within semi-structured interviews, we can use any number of different types of questions. They tend to be either questions that are introducing questions, so they introduce a particular topic or theme that we want to talk about, follow-up questions, probing or specifying questions. So probing, if you're asking a question and people give you a sort of short answer or they give you a partial answer, it's about then asking further questions just to get more information, to find out a bit more. We have direct questions and indirect questions, questions about structuring, and we also have interpreting questions. So sometimes it's very useful when having asked a series of questions and spent some time talking with them to actually go back and reaffirm what it is that you've gained. So just making sure that your interpretation of what somebody's told you is correct. Silence is also an important thing in semi-structured interviews. Silencing isn't actually a problem. Sometimes it's a very good thing. It allows the person that you're interviewing to have some time to actually think about what their answer is going to be. Now, interviews, whether that's semi-structured or unstructured interviewing, usually takes place with individuals, but there are a number of different group techniques that we can use. Now, group techniques we think of as being expert panels or Delphi groups, focus groups, and also using technology, so using chat rooms, forums, and wikis and things like that. In this slide series, we're actually going to look specifically at focus groups as a technique to interviewing groups of people. Now, focus groups, they are what we think of as being an organised discussion with a selected group of individuals to gain information about their views and experiences of a particular topic. Now, formats, when we're thinking about interviewing groups of people, that can be either group interviewing or it can be focus group based. Now, group interviewing is actually about interviewing a number of people at the same time, and the emphasis is on questions and responses between the research and the participants. With focus groups, we're looking at a slightly different thing. The emphasis is actually on the interaction within the group based on the topics that are supplied by the researchers, so they're slightly different things. With focus groups, the first questions that are always asked by people is, well, how many people, how many groups do I use in my research? How many focus groups do I use? Well, how big should these groups be? How involved should the researcher be in that? So the person that's there moderating the focus group, how involved should they be in that? How do you go about selecting the participants who can participate, and do we leave focus groups to be completely unstructured, or do we put in the focus group discussion some form of structure? Unfortunately, there's no clear answer to that. It actually completely depends on what you are researching. Some topics will lend themselves to have very few groups, some will want to have more groups, and some will lend themselves to being very unstructured, and others will need to have some form of structure or rigidity about them. When thinking about using a focus group as a qualitative method in your research, there are things that you need to think about, and those are what the advantages are to using a focus group and what the disadvantages are. The advantages to using a focus group are, of course, that you have some form of degree of control with the participants. Of course, you can gather a huge amount of rich data, and focus groups are particularly good at revealing dynamic data, so that is opinions between a group of people, and watching that unfold. Disadvantages are around anonymity and confidentiality, so of course you have to people have to be happy to talk about topics with others in a group situation. You also have issues about depth validity, and that's the fact that people fail to give full accounts of what's going on because they are in a group. They may actually give you more information if they're on a one-to-one basis with you rather than talking in a group. You do have to regulate for dominant participants, so generally within a focus group there are often one or two people who are more dominant characters, and you have to be able to regulate that. The group composition and the group dynamic will be different. So if you were to put one group together and then put another group together, of course the composition of that group would be different and the dynamic would be completely different. Focus groups require a huge amount of skill and expertise from the person that's facilitating that to ensure that it runs smoothly. And of course there are issues around resourcing, so it takes a lot of time and planning and conducting to get a group of people together in the same room to talk about something. So the second qualitative primary research method we're going to look at is observation. Now, observation we often think of actually in the context of ethnography, and that's about the study of people in natural settings, where the researcher is involved in that natural setting and tries to capture social meanings from ordinary activities that people take part in. So when we think about observation, ethnography and the overall context of people and what they're doing, where they're doing it, and how they're doing it is part of that. There are two main types of observation that we have. We have what we call covert and overt observation. Now, overt observation is where people actually know what you're doing, and there's absolutely no attempt at concealment. Covert observation is where people don't know what you're doing, and you deliberately conceal yourself and your purpose. Observation obviously can take place in closed settings or open or public settings. So closed settings we think of as, being like, think of being enclosed within a building, so within a particular company or within a school. Open and public settings are, wherever it is that you may be observing, within communities, shopping centres, so on and so forth. Of course, these rules aren't exact, but the key issue with observation is actually gaining access to the social situation that you want to research, and trying to maintain some form of relationship with the people that you want to study. Now, there are a number of different roles for the observer. So for the ethnographer, for the person that's actually watching what's going on, you can be a complete participant as a researcher, so you can actually be a member of a social group, and your identity is actually not known. You can also play the part of the participant as observer, so that is, you're a member of a social group, and your identity is known to members, so they know that you are a researcher and you are doing observation. You can then move further into the observer role instead, so moving away from being a complete participant, so being immersed and people not really knowing who you are and the sense that you're a researcher, to then moving to people knowing who you are but still being an active member of that social group, to then moving into being more an observer than a participant, so the researcher is mainly an interviewer with relatively few opportunities to participate in that particular social group's life. And of course you can be a complete observer, so that's where you have absolutely no interaction whatsoever with the social group that you're observing. So your participation with the social group that you're observing can be either active or passive, and that depends completely on the situation. Now, with ethnography or observing, the important thing is about taking notes. Okay, so it'd be impossible for you to be able to remember everything that you have observed, so you need to take field notes. Field notes are sort of detailed summaries of the events or behaviours that you've watched, and what your initial reactions and reflections are of that. Types of field notes: you can have mental notes. Okay, so you just take mental notes in your head, and that you use those kind of things when it's inappropriate to actually be seen to be note-taking. You can take jotted notes. Those are sort of brief notes of, when detailed note-taking in front of people is inappropriate, you just take a few brief notes down. Full field notes, you do these as soon as possible. So it's the main source of data for your research, so you need to make your field notes as soon as possible. So once you've finished doing your observation, it's about sitting down, reflecting, and actually writing up your full field notes as soon as you can. Now, using methods, it is actually very, very rare for research just to use one method. So you're very unlikely to use one quantitative method or one qualitative method to undertake your research. The choice of the research methods that you use is dependent on what methods are best suited to answering your research question. Now, sometimes this will involve actually mixing your methods, and that is either using more than one method, so using a survey and a structured observation, or using an unstructured interview through a focus group format and also going and doing some observation, or it's about using more than one method of a different type, i.e. using a survey, so a quantitative method, and using a semi-structured interview to follow up with as a qualitative method. So sometimes it's actually appropriate to mix your methods, and mixed methods we are going to talk about in the following slide set, so slide set 7.